Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I do my best to stay within the 30 minutes. My talk is called Migration and the Unity Society, and the Unity of Society, a Liberal Perspective. Joseph Cairns famously argues that birthright citizenship is a morally arbitrary fact. I disagree. Citizenship is a status concept, and status is not defined by facts but by rules. And like all rules, also the rules that assign citizenship are first inherently normative, secondly they are open to criticism from a moral point of view, and third they have to be adjusted to structural societal transformations from time to time. In light of the last point, I suggest that we take migration for granted and rethink the conceptual framework for a normative analysis and conceptual analysis of citizenship and the unity of society. And in the following, I will propose a model for a liberal transnational framework that is different from communitarian, republican, nationalist, and cosmopolitan analysis. So my paper has 5 sections, and you should have a handout that tells you about the sections. I will speak first, give an exposition of the problem. Then there's second section, a rule-based analysis of citizenship and the unity of society. Third, the normative relevance of political agency. Fourth, reasoning from a moral point of view. And 5, I'm going to give 2 illustrations of how the framework works. I start with the first point, exposition of the problem. In the following, I will be exclusively concerned with issues concerning citizenship and voluntary migration. And 3 empirical assumptions are crucial for my understanding of the problem. I will assume throughout that voluntary migration is motivated by something like economic interests related to personal life plans, like training, career, or something, or biographical reasons, but I will disregard issues of family unification because it raises issues beyond interests that cannot be addressed in a 30-minute presentation. I will also assume throughout that voluntary migration is not necessarily intended to be permanent or to aim at naturalization in the host society. The point is not that immigrants should be denied the option of naturalization, but that they might decide not to choose it, but to return to their country of origin after a time. Second, I consider it obvious that voluntary migration is triggered or caused by sociopolitical and economic differences among societies, for short, an unequal distribution of economic and social opportunities. Economic and social opportunities, however, are neither naturally allocated nor randomly distributed. They're generated and shaped by political agency and societal practices at the level of particular risk society, considered as sociopolitical entities in a collective sense. Third, the institution of citizenship and the normative issues of migration as we know them are shaped by the present institutional system of statehood. I therefore think that the theoretical framework for their analysis must accept that system of statehood rather than argue for the elimination of borders or giving up states at all. Maybe state institutions will be replaced by other forms of organizing political associations in the future, but then issues concerning migration and citizenship will be entirely different from what they are now. So that brings me to my second point, a rule-based analysis of citizenship and the unity of society. To conceive of citizenship as a status concept implies that it is conventional. Although conventional, however, it is not arbitrary, but embedded into the rule-guided framework of the international system of statehood. Speaking of states indeed makes sense only if we assume that there exists a plurality of particular states and societies. Assignment of citizenship status by rules serves a systemic function, namely to draw the lines of demarcation between those persons who are included in any particular society and those who are excluded. If states and societies are considered to constitute intergenerational entities, then birthright citizenship, that is the inclusion of descendants of citizens born within the territory of a state, qualifies as a default rule of inclusion, not because it's an arbitrary fact, but for conventional reasons. However, the important point of a rule-based analysis of citizenship is that the default rule ought not to be the unique rule if we accept transnational mobility. Further rules of inclusion that assign citizenship, e.g. by residence, jus soli, by normative standards for family unification, and by immigration policies ought to supplement jus sanguinis rules. We should therefore think of the rules of inclusion and exclusions as sets of regulations that combine a heterogeneous plurality of normative standards and criteria. I will assume that the validity or legitimacy assessments apply to the sets in its entirety. All justified rules qualify as prima facie valid, and none qualifies as absolutely valid without exception or limitation. The rule-based account provides us with a concept of state citizenship in the sense of Nationalität or Staatsbürgerschaft, and I suggest that we conceive of the rules of inclusion and exclusion that determine citizenship also as determining the unity of society in the formal sense of establishing separate and particularist society. Such an analysis is purely institutional and formal, but it reflects the present practice. Unlike most alternative liberal concepts, it does not articulate a normative ideal, and it has the advantage that it also applies to non-ideal liberal states, to non-liberal societies, to divided societies, to multinational societies, etc. A rule-based analysis of citizenship avoids an apparent paradox that haunts voluntaristic and contractarian accounts of citizenship inclusion and the unity of society, as well as accounts based on pure procedural justice, such as discourse ethics. The paradox is this: if we assume that the constitution of a society or membership in a society or of a particular demos requires some form of consent or a unanimous decision of all affected persons, then it appears that we first have to identify the individuals whose consent is required for the constitution of the group, which presupposes that we already have identified the group. I do not think that the paradox is a real paradox. From the perspective of a rule-based account, it does not exist. For rules apply to persons, but are largely, though not fully, justified by morally substantive considerations and impartial normative standards of justice. To the extent that rules qualify as morally justified, they applied also to individual persons who were never asked for their consent and never gave it. A rule-based analysis explains how assignments of citizenship differ from voluntary membership. It also provides us with a purely institutional account of the unity of society in the formal sense. Now, a standard objection to the formal analysis of concepts of citizenship and the unity of society is that it is too formal. It ignores the fact that democratic citizenship aims not at formal inclusion, but at the well-functioning of the practice of democracy. And I think the objection is correct. But it does not require that we adopt a more politicized conception of citizenship, a communitarian or republican ideal. After all, not all persons who qualify as citizens in the sense of state citizenship also qualify as citizens in the political sense. Children are the most common example. They have state citizenship but are not members of the demos. I rather suggest that we diversify conceptions of citizenship. The general idea of a rule-based analysis of concepts of citizenship is not at all restricted to state citizenship. It can easily and fruitfully be applied for the analysis of democratic citizenship too, and in a way that differs from communitarian, liberal, nationalist, and republican ideals. If we conceive of democracy as a socio-political practice, the rules of inclusion and exclusion that assign democratic citizenship will have to be assessed and determined in light of the background rules and socio-political preconditions that facilitate the practice of democratic government. The analysis is structurally the same as in the case of state citizenship. The relevant difference between state citizenship and democratic citizenship comes from the differences in the rule and background conditions that are relevant and have to be taken into account. Obviously, the general framework is not tied to institutional framework of the nation state either. It could be extended to supranational frameworks, but I will not pursue that matter here further. Since the normative logic of a rule-based analysis of status assignment is not tied to shared residence, it would allow us to disentangle citizenship and residence and to rethink the status of migrants as non-resident citizens from the perspective of the societies of origin, as well as non-citizen residents from the perspective of host societies. In the rest of my presentation, however, I will explore normative questions concerning the rules of inclusion and exclusion of migrants motivated by economic and life plan-related interests, primarily with respect to access. This requires to assess the normative status of individual non-citizens, namely migrants, vis-à-vis co-citizens and societies considered as collectives. That brings me to my third point, the normative relevance of political agency. Mainstream liberal accounts in philosophy for an ethics of migration tend to challenge the assumption that the international system of statism is just or even justifiable from a moral point of view because conditions concerning well-being and access to socioeconomic opportunities are highly unequal. Although the observation seems correct, I disagree with the mainstream explanation because I think that there is sufficient evidence that societal differences, to a large extent, reflect differences in political agency and particularistic socio-political practices. That is to say, difference in the choice of economic policies and other regulations, investments in infrastructure, varying degrees of honesty and corruption, political past decisions, etc. The international system, so to speak, is the wrong tree to bark at, because what matters is not abstract concepts, and abstract institutional designs, but what matters is political agency. Political agency, however, falls into the sphere of empirically contingent phenomena, not in that of abstract conceptions of statehood or external sovereignty, and it has a historically diachronic dimension. Obviously, not all societal differences can be explained by political agency, and certainly not all can be explained exclusively in terms of domestic political agency. The important point here is that the empirically contingent nature of the kind of considerations that have to be taken into account if political agency is normatively different are very different from our well-known abstract conceptions, ideal type conceptions of statehood and sovereignty. In addition, political agency generates particularized relations of justice and injustice that differ from conceptions of justice as the primary virtue of social institutions in Rawls's sense. Borrowing Rawls's terminology, one might say that agency-based political justice concerns not the basic structure of society, but the immediate and long-term consequences of collective political decision and socio-cultural practices for social participants. Obviously, political agency is not even restricted to the domestic sphere, but also exercised internationally, and can then create particularistic spheres of international political justice. In my opinion, requirements of particularistic justice at the domestic as well as the international level matter in normative assessments of migration and the unequal distribution of socioeconomic opportunities. Taking account of the normative relevance of political agency defeats, in my opinion, any hope of developing a priori universally standards or criteria for immigration that apply to all societies equally at all times and under all circumstances. The best political philosophy can accomplish is to develop standards for the assessment of the normative validity of arguments in migration debates and to point out the class of considerations that are relevant. So that brings me to my fourth section, reasoning from a moral point of view. One of the standard approaches to moral reasoning in contexts that require that we weigh and balance normative considerations of different sources or kinds, and that we assess them partly in light of empirically contingent aspects, is reasoning from a moral point of view. Moral point of view reasoning aims at normative assessments of general standards for the weighing and balancing of a plurality of morally relevant considerations, so it's pretty abstract. Apart from applying to considerations that are neither a priori nor universal, reasoning from a moral point of view follows the same normative logic of ethical individualism as mainstream liberal theories. It just yields quite different judgments in many cases than when you start with a prefixed account of what justice requires and then apply it to a field. Let me briefly outline how I think that the moral point of view framework should be aligned with the rule-based analysis of concepts of citizenship. From a moral point of view, institutional systems, and this includes the international system of statehood, should be arranged in such a way that individuals are free to pursue their justified interests freely, as long as doing so does not violate justified moral claims of others, and to the extent that doing so is compatible with granting others roughly equal freedom to pursue their justified interests. To the extent that the pursuit of economic and life plan-related interests qualify as justified, they ought to be accepted as valid consideration for the justification of prima facie liberty rights for pursuing them at the domestic as well as at the transnational level. Impartiality requires that interests that qualify as justified irrespectively of the representative person who has them. And in the case of migration, the primarily relevant persons are probably individual migrants, societies of origin, potential host societies considered as collectives, and individual members of potential host societies. For reasons of brevity, I will only consider potential migrants and members of potential host societies in the following. Two general claims seem to me to be defensible. First, individual persons have a prima facie liberty right to migration, and second, transnational respect for this prima facie liberty right demands that all society must adopt legal regulations for temporary and permanent immigration, and maybe also for naturalization. However, an acknowledgement of a prima facie liberty right to migration does not imply that any society must accept any and all potential immigrants that want to join it. It implies only that denial of access must be based on reasons that can be impartially justified from a moral point of view. Respect for the pursuit of justified interests on the side of the affected parties, however, cannot be the only kind of normatively relevant considerations, because a transnational framework will have to reflect also morally substantive claims and individual rights of the requirements of the universal justice type and of the particularist justice type. I would like to address one such requirement in the following, that is the principle of popular sovereignty, because from a liberal point of view, the principle of popular sovereignty is not simply an interest or a political preference, but a requirement of justice. If justified economic and life plan-related interests of potential immigrants conflict with morally substantive requirements of justice of host societies, then the morally substantive claims should prima facie be granted to have more weight than justified interests. This leads me to a second basic assumption of the model. If we assume that rules of inclusion and exclusions are sets that combine a plurality of heterogeneous rules, then it is highly unlikely that justification from a moral point of view will single out just one unique set that qualifies as justified for all societies under all circumstances for all times. At the end, the final set of rules that any society selects from the range of generally permissible combinations will have to be determined by decision. Within a rule-based analysis, however, the question is not the voluntaristic one, how can we identify the members of the group whose consent is required, but the institutional one, which institutional entity is authorized to make that decision. As long as we argue within the institutional framework of statehood, I think that the most obvious candidates for authorization are political associations considered as collective entities, because the principle of collective self-determination is a basic norm of the entire system. From a liberal perspective, which combines consideration of external sovereignty with popular sovereignty, the authority should be attributed to the legislative branch of government, not to the executive branch, and certainly not to courts or the judiciary. Given the general outline, I would now like to illustrate how the framework works by addressing the question of whether discriminatory rules of inclusion can ever be justifiable from a liberal moral point of view. And I chose that question because liberal mainstream theorists tend to deny such a possibility. That's my last point. And are discriminatory rules, immigration rules, justifiable? Let's start with an issue of positive discrimination concerning groups. Is it morally permissible that host societies prioritize certain groups of immigrants, that is, immigrants with special skills or special professions, nurses, doctors, etc.? So this is how I would reason through such a question. Starting with the justified interest of members of potential host societies, it seems empirically sound to assume that those interests won't be homogeneous. Most likely, the interests of different representative groups will compete or conflict, and the standard method for settling conflicts of justified interests in democratic societies is collective decision based on majority vote, because democratically embedded majority vote qualifies as a mechanism of pure procedural justice. Majority vote, however, cannot be transferred to conflicts of interest that concern individual potential migrants on the one hand and democratic societies considered as collective entities on the other hand. The main reason is that in order to function as a mechanism of pure procedural justice, majority vote must be supported by a larger set of non-procedural background rules, and that it must be practiced regularly. Sporadic and irregular majority vote will most likely fail to generate the acceptance of the results as legitimate. So it undermines the legitimate generating potential of democratic decision-making. The background rules and general practices that guarantee democratic legitimacy are currently absent at the level of transnational relations. My personal view is that it will be hard to establish them at that level, at the transnational level, because their practice presupposes a roughly diachronic continuous demos, and that decisions are made continuously over and across a variety of issues. But it's not excluded that at some point it could be established. Yeah. At the moment, this leaves us with the problem of how to weigh interests in cases where interests of individual immigrants conflict with democratically established interests of host societies considered as collective entities. Here's a proposal in 2 steps. Interests of society considered as collectives are backed up by democratic decisions should be granted more weight than justified interests of individuals, and the reason is not that societies are larger or more important than individuals, but that the practice of democratic decision-making is generally recognized as a self-standing source of requirements of political justice of a particular kind. Democratically backed up decisions articulate not merely interests, but are meant to organize and shape long-term policies and societal institutions. To the extent that political associations have a right to collective self-determination, collective democratic decisions should be granted more weight than pursuit of individual interests. This does, of course, not imply that there are no moral constraints on democratic decision at all, but simply that individual interests of non-citizens do not per se qualify as such constraints. So let's have a look at the position of potential migrants. A prima facie liberty right to migration does not empower individual migrants with the right to choose host societies by individual discretion. Accordingly, potential immigrants have no claim of being accepted by any particular society. In a world with approximately 198 states, the prima facie liberty to migration is not unjustly restricted if societies are permitted to deny immigration in cases of serious conflicts of interest. Even though I conclude that positive discrimination is prima facie permissible to some extent, the judgment cannot be final because an impartial assessment must also take account of conflicts of justified interests among different groups of potential migrants, for example, high-skill and low-skill immigrants. If justified interests qualify as a basis for the acknowledgement of liberty rights, then impartiality requires that the interests of all representative groups ought to be considered as equally valid. It cannot be required that any representative group sacrifices justified interests in order to promote justified interests of any other group, unless they are in some sense primarily responsible for the conditions that motivate potential migration of other groups. Yeah? So do not think that anything like the difference principle of optimizing the position of the least well-off person is available in the present context. Although equal consideration will most likely will not exclude prioritization, it will allow for some form of prioritization, it will exclude total neglect of any single group. And in my opinion, the considerations just mentioned support an immigration quota system that is generally open to immigrants of all different groups, where numbers of the persons who are granted access can vary among the different groups. The second point, if I have time for that, yes, concerns negative discrimination and the inclusion of individual persons from the demos. So it's not groups, but individual persons. The most contested question in this context appears to concern the right of host society to exclude individual persons from membership in the demos if they pursue anti-democratic political aims. If democracy is not a personal preference but a morally substantive requirement, and if it is plausible that more weight ought to be given to morally substantive claims than to justified interest, then the exclusion of anti-democratic individuals is prima facie justified. The problem, I think, is not so much a question of weighing and balancing, but of the identification of individuals who hold anti-democratic views and how they are identified. The legitimacy of discriminating against immigrants with anti-democratic attitudes is frequently challenged with 2 objections, at least in my discipline. And the first, maybe a little bit surprising, is the freedom of religion argument. because a lot of the discussion appears to, in the public and in philosophical tests, context concerns fundamentalist, Muslim, anti-democratic individual persons. So the freedom of religion argument maintains that from a liberal point of view and a moral liberal point of view, discrimination against anti-democratic attitudes or activities based on religion is illegitimate because liberalism is committed to acknowledge a universal right to freedom of religion that applies to potential migrants and resident immigrants too. My reply is that the rejection of immigration does not violate the individual's right to freedom of religion. It limits the individual's freedom to pursue their prima facie justified liberty, right, or interest in migration. It is one thing to force individuals to forsake the practice of their religious faith, and it is an entirely different thing to discount their justified economic interests in migration because they clash with morally substantive requirements of host societies. So now I'm talking about voluntary migration. Yeah. The reply to the first objection usually provokes a second objection, which I call the citizen-foreigner asymmetry. The second objection maintains a twofold claim, namely A, that liberal societies are committed to respect freedom of religion as well as freedom of political opinions as far as co-citizens are concerned, and B, that there is no morally relevant difference between co-citizens and foreigners. So foreigners cannot be denied access or cannot be treated differently. So if the second objection is not a straightforward petitio principii, I think it is invalid because there is a morally relevant difference between the two cases. The exclusion of co-citizens would fully deprive them of their citizenship status. Disregard for an interest in migration of foreigners by any potential host society does not deprive foreigners of their citizenship status in their society of origin. I think it's highly reasonable to demand that the annihilation of citizenship status requires stronger moral counterclaims than denial of respect for the pursuit of justified interests if those interests conflict with morally substantive claims. Obviously, there would be much more to say about impartial assessment of the justifiability of positive and negative discrimination, and there is a load of further consideration that should have been taken into account, but I think the general picture of the general account should be relatively clear. We try to find impartial standards for weighing and balancing. To come back to the general framework of a rule-based analysis of citizenship concepts, I would like to emphasize at the end that I discussed the moral permissibility of positive and negative discrimination. I did not argue that societies ought to discriminate, and I would therefore like to recall that in the context of a rule-based account, or in the context of the rule-based account that I proposed, the authority to make any such decisions lies with the legislative branch of government, not the executive and not the judiciary. Thank you very much for your patience.